Samuel wiped his hands on his worn-out jeans and exhaled slowly as he glanced at the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. The numbers blurred together, but the message was clear he was falling further behind. Rent was due in a week, and the grocery budget was already stretched thin. He turned his attention to his daughter, Lily, who sat at the small dining table, carefully coloring a picture of a house with a big tree in the front yard. "Daddy, do we have any more apples?" she asked, tilting her head. Samuel walked over to the fridge and opened it. A few eggs, half a loaf of bread, and a nearly empty carton of milk greeted him. He sighed and grabbed the last apple, slicing it up and placing it on a small plate. "Here you go, sweetheart." Lily beamed. "Thanks, Daddy." As she munched on her snack, Samuel's gaze drifted to the window. Across the street, he saw his elderly neighbor, Margaret, sitting alone on her porch. She was always alone. He had lived in this house for over a year now, and in all that time, he had never seen anyone visit her. She wasn't unfriendly, just quiet. Sometimes she would wave, but mostly she kept to herself. "Daddy, why doesn't Miss Margaret have any friends?" Lily asked, following his gaze. Samuel shrugged. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe she likes being alone." Lily frowned. "That sounds sad." Samuel hesitated, then glanced at the bills again. He had plenty of his own problems to deal with, but something about the loneliness in Margaret's eyes struck him. He knew what it felt like to struggle, to feel like the world was moving forward while you were stuck in place. Before he could overthink it, he wiped his hands on his jeans again and made a decision. "Come on, Lily, let's go say hello." Lily clapped her hands excitedly and hopped off her chair. Together, they walked across the street. Margaret looked up as they approached. She was in her late 70s, with silver hair neatly pulled back into a bun. Her deep-set blue eyes held a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Hello, Miss Margaret," Samuel greeted, offering a small smile. "We just wanted to stop by and say hi." Margaret blinked, then slowly smiled. "Well, isn't that kind of you? I don't get many visitors." Lily stepped forward. "Do you want to come over for dinner? Daddy makes really good grilled cheese." Margaret chuckled, her laughter light but genuine. "Grilled cheese, you say? That does sound lovely." Samuel hesitated for a moment. He hadn't planned on inviting her over, and food was already tight, but the way Margaret's eyes softened at Lily's invitation made it impossible to take it back. "Yes," he said, "we'd love to have you." Margaret's smile grew. "I'd be honored." As they walked back to their house, Margaret moved at a slow but steady pace. "You're a very kind young man, Samuel," she said. "Not many people take the time to check on their neighbors anymore." Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. "It's nothing, really, just seemed like the right thing to do." Inside, he set about making dinner while Lily chatted excitedly with Margaret. The meal was simple grilled cheese and tomato soup, but Margaret praised it as if it were a feast. "This reminds me of when I used to cook for my husband," she said, stirring her soup. "He passed away many years ago." "I'm sorry," Samuel said sincerely. Margaret waved a hand. "It happens, but it does get lonely." She glanced at Lily, who was happily dipping her sandwich into her soup. "Your daughter is a sweetheart." Samuel smiled. "She's the best thing in my life." After dinner, Margaret helped wash the dishes, ignoring Samuel's protests. As she dried a plate, she glanced around the small, slightly worn-down kitchen. "You've made a lovely home here, even if things are a bit tight." Samuel tensed. He hated when people noticed. "We manage," he said, keeping his tone light. Margaret studied him for a moment but didn't press. Instead, she placed a wrinkled hand on his arm. "If you ever need anything, Samuel, don't hesitate to ask." He nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but knowing he wouldn't take her up on it. He had been getting by on his own for a long time. As Margaret left that evening, she turned at the door and smiled warmly. "Thank you for inviting me over, Samuel. It meant more than you know." Samuel watched her walk back to her house, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He had invited her over thinking he was doing something kind for her. But somehow, he felt like he had gained something, too. The next morning, Samuel found himself looking out the window again, his eyes drawn to Margaret's house. Something about their dinner together lingered in his mind. He had expected it to be a simple act of kindness, but he hadn't anticipated how much he would enjoy her company. Margaret had a quiet, steady presence, and for the first time in a long while, he hadn't felt the weight of his struggles pressing down on him, even if just for an evening. Lily, still in her pajamas, climbed onto a chair at the table and swung her legs. "Do you think Miss Margaret eats breakfast alone?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Samuel poured a small portion of cereal into a bowl for her. "Probably," he replied. Lily took a bite, chewing slowly. "That's not nice. We should invite her again." Samuel hesitated. They barely had enough food as it was, but before he could come up with a reason to say no, Lily was already slipping off her chair and hurrying to the front door. "Lily, wait." Before he could stop her, she dashed across the street and knocked on Margaret's door. Samuel sighed and wiped his hands on a dish towel before following. Margaret opened the door a moment later, fully dressed in a soft blue cardigan and neatly pressed slacks. "Well, good morning, my dear," she greeted Lily warmly. "Do you want to have breakfast with us?" Lily asked, tilting her head. Margaret's expression softened as she glanced at Samuel. "That is a lovely offer, but I wouldn't want to impose." Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. "Lily can be very persuasive," he admitted. Margaret chuckled. "In that case, I'd be delighted. I just have to grab something, so give me a few seconds." As they walked back to the house, Margaret spoke easily with Lily, asking her about school and her favorite books. Samuel listened, appreciating how naturally she connected with his daughter. Once inside, Margaret took in the modest kitchen again, but this time, instead of simply observing, she moved to the counter. "Hope you don't mind, but I brought something with me," she said, producing a small bag from her pocket. She pulled out a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of homemade jam. Samuel's eyebrows lifted. "You didn't have to do that." "Nonsense," Margaret said, waving a hand. "Always keep extra. No sense in letting good food go to waste." Lily's eyes lit up. "Ooh, can we have toast?" Margaret nodded. "That's the plan." Samuel hesitated for only a moment before accepting her offer. He toasted the bread, while Margaret spread the jam onto the slices with careful precision. The aroma of warm bread filled the kitchen, and for the first time in a long while, breakfast felt more like a shared experience than just another meal to get through. As they ate, Margaret glanced at Samuel thoughtfully. "You're a good father," she said. Samuel looked up from his plate. "I try," he said simply. Margaret nodded. "It's not always easy, though, is it?" For a moment, he considered brushing off the question, but something about Margaret's gaze made him pause. She wasn't prying, just observing. "No, it's not," he admitted, "but I do what I can." Margaret stirred her tea. "I admire that." After breakfast, Margaret insisted on washing the dishes, despite Samuel's protests. As she dried the last plate, she glanced at him again. "Do you work nearby?" Samuel leaned against the counter. "I do odd jobs, carpentry, repairs, things like that. Work's been slow lately, though." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "You have a good set of hands for that kind of work. Skilled labor is valuable." Samuel chuckled. "Not valuable enough, apparently." Margaret studied him for a moment. "You never know when opportunities will come knocking." Something about the way she said it made Samuel tilt his head. Before he could ask what she meant, Lily tugged on Margaret's hand. "Can we go to the park today?" Margaret smiled. "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea." Samuel hesitated. There were things he needed to do, jobs to search for, bills to figure out, but as he looked at Lily's hopeful face and Margaret's gentle smile, he found himself nodding. All right, he said, let's go. The park was only a short walk away. Lily ran ahead to the swings, while Samuel and Margaret followed at a slower pace. Margaret sat down on a bench, smoothing her cardigan. I used to come here often when my husband was alive, she said, watching the children play. We would sit right on this bench and feed the birds. Samuel glanced at her. You don't come here anymore. Margaret shook her head. Not much reason to on my own. Samuel nodded, understanding far too well what it meant to do things alone. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Lily climb the jungle gym. Margaret finally broke the quiet. You know, Samuel, I've met a lot of people in my life, some kind, some not so kind. But you remind me of my husband. Samuel blinked. How so? Margaret smiled softly. He always put others before himself, even when he didn't have much. He believed that kindness had a way of finding its way back to you. Samuel exhaled slowly. That's a nice thought. Margaret turned to him. It's more than a thought, Samuel, it's true. He looked at her, sensing that there was more to her words than just sentiment. But before he could ask, Lily came running up, breathless from playing. Can we come again tomorrow? She asked. Margaret chuckled. If your father doesn't mind. Samuel glanced at Margaret, then at Lily. I think that sounds like a good idea. As they walked back home, Samuel found himself realizing something. Margaret wasn't just someone he had invited over for dinner out of kindness. She was becoming a part of their lives, and he didn't mind that one bit. The days passed, and Margaret became a regular presence in Samuel and Lily's lives. She would stop by in the mornings with small treats like fresh muffins or jars of jam, and in the evenings, she would sit with them on the porch, sharing stories about her past. Samuel found himself looking forward to those moments. There was something reassuring about her presence, like a steady lighthouse in a storm. One afternoon, as Samuel was fixing the loose railing on his front steps, Margaret walked over from her house, a thoughtful expression on her face. She watched him work for a moment before speaking. You have a real talent for this sort of thing, she said. Samuel wiped his hands on an old rag. It's just something I've always been good at, he admitted. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Have you ever considered doing larger projects, something beyond just small repairs? Samuel shrugged. I've thought about it, but steady work isn't easy to come by. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then leaned on the porch railing, watching him with an appraising look. I might know someone who could use a skilled pair of hands, she said slowly. Samuel looked up. Oh. She nodded. An old friend of mine owns a few properties in town. He's always looking for reliable help with renovations and maintenance. Could put in a good word for you. Samuel hesitated. He wasn't used to people offering help, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. But Margaret had never given him a reason to doubt her. That would be really kind of you, he said. Margaret patted his arm. Let me make a call. No promises, but it's worth a try. Samuel nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. Later that evening, Margaret joined them for dinner again. After Lily had gone to bed, she and Samuel sat on the porch, the cool night air settling around them. Samuel, she said after a long silence, why did you invite me to dinner that first night? He glanced at her, surprised by the question. Lily was the one who asked you, he admitted. But I guess I saw something in you, maybe because I know what loneliness feels like. Margaret nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. It means more than you know, she said quietly. Samuel studied her for a moment. You've been alone for a long time, haven't you? Margaret exhaled softly. Yes, my husband passed many years ago and we never had children. Over time, friends moved away or passed on. It's strange how life can become so quiet. Samuel understood that feeling all too well. He had lost his wife when Lily was just a baby, and since then, it had been just the two of them. You don't have any family left?" he asked. Margaret smiled faintly. Distant relatives, but no one close. Truthfully, I stopped expecting company a long time ago. Samuel felt a pang of sadness for her. "Well, you have us now," he said firmly. Margaret's smile warmed. "Yes, I do." The next day, true to her word, Margaret made a phone call. A few hours later, she knocked on Samuel's door. "I spoke to my friend," she said. "He wants to meet you tomorrow morning. He's looking for someone to help renovate an old house he just bought." Samuel blinked, surprised at how quickly things had moved. "That's incredible. Thank you, Margaret." She waved a hand. "You've helped me more than you know, Samuel. It's nice to return the favor." The following morning, Samuel met Margaret's friend, a man named Henry, at an old but sturdy house on the edge of town. Henry was in his 60s, with a no-nonsense attitude and an eye for detail. He walked Samuel through the property, explaining the work that needed to be done. "You come highly recommended," Henry said, crossing his arms. "Margaret speaks very highly of you." Samuel felt a twinge of gratitude. "I appreciate the opportunity," he said. Henry nodded. "I'm looking for someone reliable. If you do good work, this could turn into something long-term." Samuel shook his hand. "I won't let you down." As he walked home later that day, a strange feeling settled in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt like things were changing. Like maybe, just maybe, he was finally catching a break. That evening, he told Margaret about the meeting. She listened, nodding with approval. "I had a feeling you'd make a good impression," she said. Samuel smiled. "I don't know how to thank you." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. "Just keep being the person you are, Samuel. That's thanks enough." As the sun set, Samuel realized something. Margaret had come into their lives when they least expected it, and somehow she had changed everything. And in return, he had given her something to a place where she belonged. Samuel woke up earlier than usual, a sense of purpose settling into his bones. The new job opportunity with Henry gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time: stability. It wasn't just about paying off overdue bills or stretching groceries to last the week. It was about having steady work, about knowing he could provide for Lily without constantly worrying about what he'd have to sacrifice next. By the time Lily was awake and getting ready for school, Samuel had already packed a small lunch for himself and was preparing to leave for the day. Margaret had arrived shortly after, as she often did, bringing a bag with fresh bread and fruit. She greeted Lily warmly before turning to Samuel. "Big day ahead?" she asked, watching as he laced up his worn-out boots. "Yes," he said, adjusting the strap on his tool bag. "Henry wants me to go over some of the renovation plans with him today." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good. Have a feeling this will be the start of something great for you." Samuel didn't want to get ahead of himself, but he couldn't deny that things were looking up. He gave Lily a quick hug and promised he'd be back before dinner, then headed out. The day at the job site was productive. Henry was a straightforward man who expected hard work but was fair in his expectations. Samuel found himself settling into a rhythm, measuring wood, fixing structural issues, and going over renovation plans with the team. It felt good to be doing something productive, something that played to his strengths. At the end of the day, Henry clapped him on the back. "I like your work ethic," he said. "If you're up for it, I'd like to keep you on for more projects after this one." Samuel hadn't expected the offer so soon, but he wasn't about to turn it down. "I'd appreciate that," he said. Henry nodded. "I'll have some paperwork for you by the end of the week. We'll make things official." Samuel left the job site feeling lighter than he had in months. A steady job meant security, meant a future where he wasn't constantly scraping by. When he arrived home, Margaret was still there, sitting with Lily at the dining table. They were finishing up a puzzle, and Lily looked up excitedly when she saw him. "Daddy, Miss Margaret helped me with the hardest part." Margaret chuckled. She gives me too much credit. She figured most of it out herself. Samuel set his tool bag down and stretched. It's good to see you both enjoying yourselves. Margaret watched him closely. How was the first day? Better than I expected, he admitted. Henry wants me to stay on for more projects. Margaret's expression softened. I knew he would. Samuel glanced at her curiously. You seem pretty confident about that. Margaret took a breath, her hands resting on the edge of the table. Samuel, there's something I need to tell you. The shift in her tone made him pause. He pulled out a chair and sat down, waiting. Margaret folded her hands and looked at him directly. I never told you much about my husband. He was a businessman, very successful in real estate. When he passed, he left me everything. Samuel blinked. Everything. Margaret nodded. I don't talk about it much because, well, money doesn't replace companionship. And over the years, I saw how wealth changed the way people treated me. So, kept to myself. Samuel listened carefully, trying to process what she was saying. Margaret continued. When you and Lily invited me over that first night, you didn't know anything about me. You didn't do it because you wanted something, you did it out of kindness. That meant more to me than you could ever imagine. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. Margaret, you don't owe me anything. She smiled gently. I know, but that's exactly why I want to do this. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded envelope, sliding it across the table to him. I want you to have this. Samuel hesitated before picking it up. He unfolded the envelope, and his breath caught when he saw the check inside. $20,000. His hands tightened around the paper. Margaret, can't accept this. Margaret's expression remained steady. Yes, you can, and you will. Samuel shook his head. This is too much. I can't take that from you. Margaret reached out and placed a hand over his. Samuel, you didn't know I had money when you invited me into your home. You weren't trying to gain anything. That's exactly why I want to do this. You and Lily have given me something hadn't had in years, a sense of family. Samuel swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. Margaret's voice softened. I see how hard you work, how much you sacrifice for your daughter. This isn't charity, Samuel. This is me helping someone I care about. Samuel looked at Lily, who was watching the conversation with wide, curious eyes. He thought about the nights he had spent worrying about bills, about stretching meals, about making ends meet. He exhaled slowly. Are you sure? Margaret gave his hand a small squeeze. Absolutely. A lump formed in Samuel's throat, but he nodded. Thank you, Margaret. I don't even know what to say. Margaret smiled warmly. Just promise me one thing. Anything. She leaned back slightly. Don't be afraid to accept help when it's given with love. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. You have my word. As the evening went on, Margaret stayed for dinner, and laughter filled the small house. Samuel felt something shift inside him. He had spent so long struggling, so long believing he had to do everything alone. But kindness had a way of coming full circle. Margaret wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was family. The next few weeks brought steady change for Samuel. Steady work, steady income, and for the first time in years, a sense of financial security. He used part of the money Margaret had given him to pay off overdue bills, ensuring that he and Lily wouldn't have to worry about rent or utilities for the foreseeable future. The rest he placed carefully into savings, determined to use it wisely. His work with Henry continued, and as the first renovation wrapped up, Samuel found himself gaining more responsibility on the job. Henry trusted him to oversee certain tasks, even allowing him to make decisions on some of the design elements. It felt good to have that trust, to be seen as more than just a worker, but as someone capable of handling bigger responsibilities. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching Lily play in the yard, Margaret joined him, a book tucked under her arm. She settled into the chair beside him, her gaze drifting toward the sky as the colors of the sunset deepened. "You look more at ease these days," she observed. Samuel nodded, stretching his legs out in front of him. "It's been a long time since I felt this way." Margaret glanced at him, a knowing expression in her eyes. "It suits you." He turned his head toward her. "You know, I never expected any of this. When Lily and I moved here, I thought it would just be another place to get by. But now—" Margaret waited, letting him find the words. Samuel exhaled. "Now it feels like home." Margaret's lips curved, and she nodded approvingly. "That's what life is about, Samuel. Finding people who make a place feel like more than just walls and a roof." He thought about that for a moment, then looked toward Lily, who was carefully arranging small stones into a pattern in the dirt. She had adapted so easily to their new life, embracing every change with the resilience that only children seemed to possess. Margaret followed his gaze before turning back to him. She's going to grow up knowing what it means to have good people around her. Samuel smiled slightly. She already does. The days continued to pass, and Samuel's life settled into a new kind of normal. His work schedule became more consistent, and with the financial burden eased, he found himself able to focus on things beyond just making ends meet. He started taking Lily out on small weekend trips to the park or the lake nearby, giving her the kind of childhood experiences he had always wanted for her. Margaret remained a constant presence, though she never overstepped. She continued to visit, bringing small gifts for Lily and sharing quiet conversations with Samuel in the evenings. He knew she valued their presence as much as they valued hers, and though they never explicitly stated it, they had formed a bond that went beyond simple friendship. One evening, as the warmth of summer began to give way to the crispness of autumn, Margaret invited Samuel and Lily over for dinner at her house. Margaret had prepared a hearty meal, and as they sat around the table, the conversation flowed easily. Lily talked animatedly about school, Margaret shared stories from her younger years, and Samuel found himself simply enjoying the moment, the warmth of good food and good company wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. After dinner, Margaret stood and retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf. She placed it in front of Samuel, her expression unreadable. "I want you to have this," she said. Samuel looked at the box, then back at her. "Margaret, you've already done so much. You don't have to give me anything else." Margaret shook her head. "This isn't about obligation. Just open it." He hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside, nestled carefully in soft fabric, was a set of old, well-worn blueprints. He picked them up, unfolding them carefully. "These belong to my husband," Margaret explained as he studied them. "He designed homes, but this was meant to be ours." Samuel's fingers traced over the lines and measurements, the careful detailing of a house that had never been built. "He never got the chance to bring it to life," Margaret continued, her voice softer now. "But I think he would have wanted someone like you to have it." Samuel looked up, searching her face. "Margaret, he struggled to find the right words. "Are you sure?" Margaret nodded. "You have a talent, Samuel, not just with your hands, but with the way you put your heart into what you do. I don't want this design to sit in a box forever. I want it to become something real." Samuel exhaled, overwhelmed by the weight of the gift. "I don't know what to say." Margaret smiled gently. "Say you'll do something with it, when the time is right." He nodded slowly, folding the blueprints carefully and placing them back in the box. "I will." As the evening came to a close and they prepared to leave, Margaret walked them to the door. She gave Lily a gentle hug before turning to Samuel. "You've given me more than you realize," she said. "A reason to look forward to each day again." Samuel met her gaze, understanding the depth of her words. "We wouldn't be here without you, Margaret." She chuckled lightly. "I think we've all helped each other in ways we didn't expect." Samuel nodded, knowing she was right. As he and Lily walked home, the cool night air wrapped around them, carrying with it the quiet hum of a town settling into the evening. Samuel glanced down at the small wooden box in his hands, feeling the weight of possibility inside it. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just surviving, he was building something. And he wasn't doing it alone.